Welcome to the Grateful Living podcast. Hi, beautiful souls. Welcome back to another episode of the Grateful Living podcast. Today's episode was actually inspired by two conversations I had recently. One was with a client and the other was with a collaborator. Two completely different women living completely different lives, but both carrying the same invisible burden. The feeling like they are somehow behind in life. And I think a lot of women in our 30s will recognize this. I know I certainly have had this at different points of my life. You know, that quiet pressure that creeps in, that sense that you should be further ahead by now, that there's a timeline that you're somehow meant to be on and that you've missed it. And what I noticed in both of these conversations is that neither of these women were actually failing. They were both functioning, both growing, both achieving in their own ways, but both of them were still carrying shame because they weren't matching an invisible expectation of what life is supposed to look like at this age. And that expectation is heavy. You know, the pressure to be married, or at least on the way to it, the pressure to own a home, the pressure to have certain levels of financial success, to have, a clear linear career path, to be healed or at least sorted, the pressure to look a certain way or date a certain type of person, to present your life in a way that makes sense to other people. And underneath all of that pressure is something deeper. Shame. Because I think what we often call feeling behind in life is actually shame in disguise. And shame has a very specific feeling. It's not just disappointment, it's not just comparison, it's the feeling that something about you is wrong because your life doesn't look the way it should. And I want to slow that down for a moment because the word should is doing a lot of the work here. I should be married by now, I should have a house, I should be further in my career, I should have this figured out. And the question always comes back to, who decided that? Because if we really unpack it, most of these expectations were never consciously chosen by us. They were absorbed by family, culture, society, social media, our friends, or even the younger versions of ourselves imagining what life would look like. And over time, those expectations become internalized and they start to feel like truth, even when they're not. And, from a psychological perspective, shame is one of the most intense human emotions we can experience. And it's very different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about identity. And that distinction is really important because when shame is activated, it doesn't just affect how you think, it affects how you feel in your body. Research shows that shame activates the same neural pathways in the brain as physical pain, which means your nervous system doesn't just register it as an emotional experience, it registers it as a threat. And this is where it gets really interesting because your nervous system is not designed to distinguish between emotional rejection and physical danger. It just detects threat. So if your brain perceives that you are not meeting expectations, or that you might be judged or excluded or misunderstood, it can trigger a stress response. Not because anything is actually wrong, but because belonging has always been tied to survival. As human beings, we're wired for connection. For thousands of years, being part of a group was essential for survival. So our nervous system learned to prioritize belonging over authenticity. Which is why so many women end up in this quiet internal conflict. Part of you that wants to be honest, and then there's part of you that wants to be accepted. And often acceptance wins. So what happens over time is subtle. You start making decisions based on approval rather than alignment. You choose what feels acceptable rather than what feels true. You stay in situations longer than you want to. You delay decisions because you're thinking about how they will be perceived. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to lose contact with yourself. Not all at once, but in small ways. You stop asking yourself what you want and you start asking what looks right, what makes sense, what other people feel comfortable with, what will avoid judgment, what will keep the peace. And from the outside, your life might look fine still, but internally something feels off. There's a quiet disconnection, a subtle exhaustion, a sense that you're performing your life rather than actually living it. And I think this becomes especially amplified in your 30s because this is the decade where society starts to ask more questions, even if they're not always spoken out loud. There is this kind of invisible checklist that starts to emerge, I think, especially in brown culture, about marriage, home ownership, career stability, financial independence, family planning. And if your life doesn't fit neatly into that structure, it can start to feel like you're doing something wrong, even when you're not, even when you're growing and you're healing and you're choosing something more aligned but less conventional. And I think that this is where the dangerous comparison comes into play, because you're not comparing your whole life to somebody else's whole life. You're comparing your internal experience to somebody else's external presentation, and that is never a fair comparison. There's this concept in psychology called introjected beliefs. These are beliefs that we absorb from our environment and begin to treat as our own. Things like, I should be married by now, I should be further ahead, I should have it together. But the important question is not whether these beliefs exist, it's whether they actually are true for you. Because many of them are inherited and not chosen, and anything that is inherited can also be questioned. So one of the most powerful things I've seen in my own life and in the women I work with is that shame often dissolves when it is spoken out loud. Because shame thrives in secrecy. It thrives in silence, it thrives in isolation. But when you bring it into awareness, something shifts. You start to realize that you're not alone in it, you're not broken, you're not the only one questioning where you are in life, because you're simply a human being navigating a very complex set of expectations. And I want to be really honest here, letting go of those expectations is not always comfortable, because at some point you will disappoint people. Because you're no longer performing the version of yourself that made them comfortable. And that can feel really unsettling. But discomfort is not danger. Disapproval isn't danger. Someone else's expectations are not your responsibility to carry. So if you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any of it, I want to leave you with a few gentle questions. Not to fix you, not to analyze you, but just to bring you back to yourself. What expectations am I carrying that were never mine to begin with? Where in my life am I choosing approval over alignment? And what would my life feel like if I stopped measuring it against everybody else's timeline? Because the truth is, you're not behind, you're not late, you're not failing, you are simply on your own timeline. And that timeline does not need to look like anybody else's in order to be valid. Thank you so much for being here with me today. And if this episode resonated, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And, feel free to drop me a message to say, hey, I feel like this too. I think it helps, like I said, to make us all feel less alone. So until next time, take good care. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at _grateful_living.